Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Science Society. Tonight, we're drifting into the warm, golden world of ancient Egypt, a civilization that rose from the desert sands and built wonders that still whisper secrets across the millennia. Before we begin this journey down the Nile, through temple corridors, and into tombs hidden beneath stone, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps other sleepy souls find their way to these quiet explorations of history and science, one restful evening at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Allow your breathing to slow. Let the modern world fade away as we step back in time, to a place where the desert met the river, and human imagination built something eternal. The gift of the Nile. Imagine standing on the banks of a great river as the sun rises over Africa. The light touches the water first, turning it to liquid copper, then gold, then the blue-green shade that gave hope to an entire civilization. This is the Nile, the longest river in the world, stretching more than 4,000 miles from the heart of the continent to the Mediterranean Sea. Without this river, there would be no Egypt. Without its predictable floods, its rich silt, its dependable rhythm, the story we are about to explore could never have been written. The ancient Egyptians themselves understood this perfectly. They called their land Kemet, which means the Black Land, referring to the rich, dark soil deposited by the Nile's annual flooding. Beyond the narrow strip of fertility that followed the river's course lay the Deshret, the red land of the desert, a vast expanse of sand and stone where almost nothing could grow, and where the heat could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. This stark division between life and death, between the green ribbon of the valley and the endless desert, shaped how the Egyptians saw their world. They lived in a place of dramatic contrasts, where abundance and desolation existed side by side. Every year, as predictable as the turning of the seasons, the Nile would swell with water from distant rains falling in the highlands of Ethiopia and Central Africa. The river would rise, spilling over its banks in a controlled flood that covered the fields with water. When the floods receded, they left behind a layer of nutrient-rich silt, dark and fertile, ready to nourish crops. This cycle was so reliable that the Egyptians based their entire calendar around it. They divided the year into 3 seasons, each lasting 4 months. There was Akhet, the inundation, when the river flooded. Then came Pere, the growing season, when farmers planted their seeds in the fresh soil. Finally, there was Shemu, the harvest time, when crops were gathered before the cycle began again. This agricultural abundance did more than feed people. It created surplus, and surplus created time. Time for some people to stop working the fields and instead become craftsmen, artists, priests, administrators, architects, and scribes. Surplus food meant that a society could support specialists, people whose entire lives were devoted to pursuits beyond simple survival. From this foundation, one of the greatest civilizations in human history slowly emerged. The geography of Egypt influenced its development in other profound ways. The deserts on either side of the Nile provided natural barriers that protected the early Egyptians from frequent invasions. Unlike Mesopotamia, where multiple civilizations constantly fought for control of the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Egypt enjoyed long periods of stability and isolation. This allowed their culture to develop with remarkable continuity. Ideas, beliefs, and traditions could mature over centuries without constant disruption from outside forces. The river also served as Egypt's highway. In a time before roads as we know them, the Nile provided a natural transportation network. Boats could sail south, upstream, pushed by the prevailing winds that blew from the Mediterranean toward the interior of Africa. When traveling north, downstream, boats could simply drift with the current. This made trade and communication remarkably easy for an ancient civilization. Goods, ideas, and innovations could flow up and down the river, uniting the land in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. Even the direction of the river influenced Egyptian thought. Because the Nile flows from south to north, the Egyptians considered south to be up and north to be down. Upper Egypt referred to the southern part of the country, near modern-day Aswan and the Nubian border, while Lower Egypt was the northern delta region where the river spreads into multiple channels before emptying into the Mediterranean. This geographic reality became woven into the very language and symbolism of their civilization. In the pre-dynastic period, before Egypt was unified into a single kingdom, the climate was less harsh than it is today. Archaeological evidence suggests that what is now barren desert was once savanna, dotted with trees and grasslands that supported diverse wildlife. Ancient rock art found in the western desert shows giraffes, elephants, and other animals that could not survive in the region today. As the climate gradually became more arid over thousands of years, people increasingly concentrated along the Nile, where water remained plentiful and reliable. This concentration of population along the river created the conditions for civilization to emerge. Small farming communities grew into villages, villages into towns, and towns into the two great kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt. Each developed its own character, its own patron deities, and its own regional traditions. But the pull toward unity was strong. The Nile connected them, and eventually, around 3100 BCE, a southern king known to us as Narmes or Menes conquered the north and unified Egypt into a single kingdom. With this unification, one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history officially began. The Egyptians never forgot that their entire world depended on the river's gift. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems to maximize the use of floodwaters, building canals and basins that could capture and distribute the water to fields beyond the river's immediate reach. They watched the river's level carefully, keeping records of high and low floods, understanding that their survival depended on predicting its behavior. When the floods were too low, famine could result. When they were too high, villages could be destroyed. But in most years, the river gave what was needed, and Egypt prospered. This annual cycle of destruction and renewal, of death and rebirth, became central to Egyptian religious thought. Just as the land died during the dry season and was reborn with the flood, so too did the Egyptians believe that human beings could die and be reborn in the afterlife. The patterns they observed in nature became templates for understanding the cosmos, the gods, and the destiny of the soul. The dawn of civilization. Long before the pyramids rose from the desert sands, long before hieroglyphs adorned temple walls, the people who would become the ancient Egyptians were learning to work together in ways that would eventually transform their world. In the Neolithic period, around 6,000 years before the Common Era, communities along the Nile were making the transition from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. This shift was gradual, unfolding over many generations, but its effects were revolutionary. These early farmers discovered which plants grew best in the rich Nile soil. Emmer wheat and barley became their staple crops, providing the grain that would become the foundation of the Egyptian diet for thousands of years. They learned to raise cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, creating reliable sources of meat, milk, and leather. They experimented with flax, which could be processed into linen thread and woven into cloth. These innovations seem simple from our modern perspective, but each one represented a breakthrough that made life more secure and comfortable. As communities grew more prosperous, they also grew more complex. Leadership structures emerged. Some individuals gained authority by demonstrating skill in organizing labor, settling disputes, or communicating with the divine forces that the people believed controlled their world. Regional centers of power began to form, each controlling a section of the river valley. These proto-states, called nomes, would remain important administrative divisions throughout Egyptian history. By around 3400 BCE, two distinct kingdoms had crystallized. Upper Egypt, in the south, was known as the White Land, named for the white crown worn by its king. Lower Egypt, in the north, where the delta fans out toward the sea, was the Red Land, associated with a red crown. For several centuries, these two kingdoms existed side by side, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in conflict, but always separate and distinct. Then came the unification. The traditional story, recorded by later Egyptian historians, tells of a king named Menes, who conquered Lower Egypt and merged the two kingdoms into one. Modern archaeology suggests this unification was probably a more gradual process involving several rulers, and that Menes might be another name for King Narmer, whose ceremonial palette, discovered at the ancient city of Hierakonpolis, shows him wearing both the white and red crowns, symbolizing his rule over both lands. The Narmer palette is one of ancient Egypt's most important artifacts. Carved from a single piece of stone, it shows scenes of the king smiting his enemies and parading in triumph. The imagery is both beautiful and brutal, depicting the violence that accompanied the birth of the unified state while also showing the king as a divine figure whose authority was absolute. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt as he raises a mace to strike a kneeling captive. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt as he reviews the bodies of beheaded enemies. Between these scenes of conquest are symbols of unity. The intertwined necks of two serpopards, mythical creatures whose long necks form a circle, perhaps representing the joining of the two lands. With unification came the need for a capital, a place from where the new kingdom could be governed. Narmer, or his immediate successors, established their capital at a city called Eneb-Hej, meaning white walls, which the Greeks would later call Memphis. The location was strategic, positioned at the junction between Upper and Lower Egypt, near the point where the Nile Valley opens into the delta. From Memphis, pharaohs could control both regions and coordinate the resources of the entire kingdom. The unification of Egypt marks the beginning of what historians call the early dynastic period, spanning roughly from 3100 to 2686 BCE. During these 4 centuries, the basic structures of Egyptian civilization fell into place. The institution of kingship, with the pharaoh as both political ruler and divine intermediary between humans and gods, became firmly established. The administrative apparatus of the state expanded, with officials appointed to collect taxes, organize labor, oversee agriculture, and maintain order. It was also during the early dynastic period that the Egyptians developed their system of writing. Hieroglyphs, the Greek word means sacred carvings, began as simple pictures representing objects and ideas. A drawing of a reed might represent a reed, but it could also represent the sound of the word for reed. Over time, these symbols became more abstract and sophisticated, capable of expressing complex thoughts, recording history, managing accounts, and preserving religious knowledge. The earliest hieroglyphs appear on labels and tags, attached to goods in royal tombs, simple identifications of the contents or owners of various items. But the script rapidly evolved. By the end of the early dynastic period, Egyptian scribes were using hieroglyphs not just for labels, but for longer texts, including religious inscriptions, royal decrees, and the beginnings of what would become a rich literary tradition. Writing was power. Those who could read and write, primarily scribes, priests, and high officials, had access to knowledge that was denied to the illiterate masses. They could record transactions, preserve information across generations, and communicate across distances. The development of writing meant that Egyptian civilization could begin to accumulate knowledge systematically, building on the discoveries of previous generations instead of losing them with each passing year. Alongside the formal hieroglyphic script, Egyptian scribes also developed a cursive form called hieratic, which was faster to write and better suited for everyday documents. While hieroglyphs were primarily carved in stone on monuments and temple walls, hieratic was written with reed pens and ink on papyrus, pottery shards, or limestone flakes. This distinction between the formal, enduring script and the practical, everyday script would persist throughout Egyptian history. The early dynastic period also saw the beginnings of the elaborate burial customs for which Egypt would become famous. Early royal tombs were large underground chambers topped with rectangular brick structures called mastabas. These tombs contained not just the body of the deceased, but also food, drink, furniture, tools, jewelry, and other goods that the dead person might need in the afterlife. The belief that life continued after death and that the deceased needed material provisions for that continuing existence was already firmly established. These early tombs hint at the extraordinary projects that would come later. The ambition to build permanent monuments, to create structures that would endure for eternity, was present from the very beginning of unified Egypt. The stage was set for the Age of Pyramids, when Egyptian builders would achieve feats of engineering and organization that still astonish us today. The Age of Pyramids. As the sun climbed higher over the desert, casting long shadows from the monuments that lined the western bank of the Nile, the Old Kingdom of Egypt entered its golden age. This was the Age of Pyramids, roughly from 2686 to 2181 BCE, when Egypt's rulers commanded resources and labor on a scale that would not be matched again for thousands of years. During this period, the pharaohs were considered not merely representatives of the gods, but gods themselves, living embodiments of divine power walking among mortals. The Pyramid Age began not with the famous smooth-sided pyramids of Giza, but with an innovation by a man whose name would echo through history, Imhotep. He served as the architect and vizier to Pharaoh Djoser during the Third Dynasty, around 2650 BCE. Before Imhotep, royal tombs were mastabas, low rectangular structures built of mud brick. Imhotep envisioned something entirely different. For his pharaoh, he designed a tomb that would reach toward the sky, a structure that would be visible for miles across the flat desert, proclaiming the power and divinity of the king. The result was the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the first large-scale stone building in human history. Imhotep began with a traditional mastaba, but then added another, smaller level on top, and then another and another, creating a pyramid with 6 distinct steps that rose to a height of over 200 feet. The design was revolutionary, but so was the choice of material. Previous royal tombs had been built from mud brick, which, though abundant and easy to work with, would eventually crumble and decay. Stone would last forever. The Step Pyramid complex was more than just a tomb. It included temples, courtyards, and underground chambers connected by miles of passages and galleries. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Columns were carved to resemble bundles of reeds. Walls were decorated with reliefs showing the king performing rituals. False doors were carved where the spirit of the deceased could pass between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Imhotep's achievement was so impressive that he was deified centuries after his death, becoming the god of medicine and healing. He was remembered as the first recorded genius in human history, a man whose innovations in architecture and engineering helped define an entire civilization. Following Imhotep's breakthrough, later pharaohs competed to build ever more impressive monuments. During the Fourth Dynasty, around 2600 BCE, the Egyptian builders perfected the true pyramid, with smooth, triangular sides rising to a point. The first to succeed was Pharaoh Sneferu, who built 3 large pyramids, experimenting with different angles and techniques before finally achieving the perfect shape at his red pyramid at Dashur. But it was Sneferu's son, Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, who would oversee the construction of the most famous pyramid of all, the Great Pyramid of Giza. This monument is so massive, so precisely constructed, and so ancient that it has spawned countless theories about its construction, some plausible, others venturing into the realm of fantasy. The reality of how the ancient Egyptians built it is almost as remarkable as any fiction. The Great Pyramid was originally 480 feet tall. making it the tallest man-made structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years. It consists of approximately 2,300,000 blocks of stone, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, though some of the granite blocks in the interior chambers weigh as much as 80 tons. The base covers 13 acres and is almost perfectly level. The sides of the pyramid are aligned to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy that would be impressive even with modern surveying equipment. How did they do it? The process began with the site itself. The pyramid sits on a plateau of bedrock that was carefully leveled by cutting channels and filling them with water, creating a perfectly flat surface. Then came the quarrying of the limestone blocks. Most of the stone came from quarries near the construction site, though the finest white limestone for the outer casing was brought from Tura across the river, and the granite for the interior chambers was transported from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. The workers, and contrary to popular belief, these were not slaves but paid laborers, many of them farmers working during the flood season when they could not tend their fields, used copper tools and wooden wedges to split the stone from the quarry face. They shaped the blocks roughly at the quarry, then transported them to the construction site. For the granite from Aswan, they loaded the enormous blocks onto barges and floated them down the Nile during the annual flood, when the river was high enough to carry such heavy cargo. At the construction site, the blocks had to be moved into position. The Egyptians likely used ramps of some kind, though the exact configuration is still debated by scholars. As each level was completed, the ramp would be extended or reconfigured to reach the next level. Some evidence suggests they used a combination of straight ramps and spiral ramps that wrapped around the growing pyramid. Workers would have dragged the blocks up these ramps using ropes and sledges, possibly lubricating the path with water to reduce friction. The precision of the interior passages and chambers is particularly impressive. The Grand Gallery, a long ascending corridor that leads to the King's Chamber, has walls that rise at an exact angle and meet at a corbelled ceiling 9 meters above the floor. The King's Chamber itself is constructed from enormous granite blocks, fitted together with such precision that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Above the chamber are 5 relieving chambers, designed to distribute the weight of all the stone above and prevent the ceiling from collapsing. The entire project took about 20 years to complete and involved a workforce that probably numbered in the tens of thousands. This required not just skilled labor, but also a massive organizational effort. Workers needed to be housed, fed, and provided with tools. Copper tools wore out quickly and needed constant replacement. Water had to be supplied. Medical care had to be available for injuries. A village near the pyramids, discovered by archaeologists, shows that the workers lived in organized dormitories, had access to medical treatment, and received rations of bread, beer, meat, and vegetables. The pyramid was not built in isolation. Khufu's son, Khafre, built his own pyramid, right next to his father's, only slightly smaller, but appearing taller because it sits on higher ground. Khafre also commissioned the Great Sphinx, a massive statue with the body of a lion and the head of a king, carved from a single outcrop of limestone. The Sphinx, worn by wind and time, still gazes eastward across the desert, an eternal guardian standing watch over the necropolis. The third Great Pyramid at Giza was built by Menkaure, Khafra's successor, and though smaller than the other two, it was no less carefully constructed. Together, these three pyramids, along with several smaller pyramids for queens and a complex of temples and causeways, created a monumental landscape that proclaimed the power and divine nature of the pharaohs. What drove this massive expenditure of resources? The pyramids were tombs, certainly, designed to protect the mummified body of the pharaoh and the treasures buried with him. But they were also theological statements. The shape of the pyramid, with its sides rising to a point, was associated with the rays of the sun. The benben, a sacred stone that represented the primordial mound from which all creation emerged, was often pyramid-shaped. By building a pyramid tomb, the pharaoh was symbolically aligning himself with the sun god Ra, and with the forces of creation itself. The pyramid was also a machine for resurrection. The various passages, chambers, and false doors were designed to facilitate the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife. The pyramid texts, religious inscriptions that first appear in pyramids of the 5th dynasty, describe spells and incantations meant to help the deceased king transform into an Akha, a blessed spirit who could dwell among the gods. The northern shaft from the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid points toward the circumpolar stars, the imperishable ones that never set, where the king's spirit would spend eternity. The Old Kingdom's obsession with pyramid building eventually contributed to its decline. The enormous resources required to construct these monuments, along with the maintenance of the associated temples and the support of large priesthoods, strained the economy. Regional governors, who commanded their own resources and armies, gradually grew more powerful and independent. Around 2281 BCE, central authority collapsed, ushering in the First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation and regional conflict. But the pyramids endured. While dynasties rose and fell, while empires conquered and were conquered, while languages evolved and died, the pyramids remained, silent witnesses to an age when human ambition reached for the eternal and, at least in stone, achieved it. Daily life along the river. While pharaohs commanded armies and priests conducted elaborate rituals in massive stone temples, most ancient Egyptians lived much simpler lives. They were farmers and craftspeople, bakers and brewers, fishermen and potters, weavers and laborers. Their days were shaped by the seasons, by the demands of agriculture, and by the needs of their families and communities. To understand ancient Egypt, we must look beyond the monuments to the ordinary lives of ordinary people. Egyptian society was highly stratified, organized into a clear hierarchy that everyone understood and accepted as the natural order of things. At the very top sat the pharaoh, considered both king and god, the living embodiment of Horus, and the intermediary between the human world and the divine realm. Below the pharaoh was his vizier, the highest-ranking official who managed the day-to-day administration of the kingdom. Then came the nobility, including regional governors, military commanders, and wealthy landowners. Below the nobility were the scribes and priests, members of what we might call the educated class. Scribes were crucial to the functioning of Egyptian civilization. They kept the records that allowed the state to function: tax records, legal documents, letters, contracts, accounts of grain storage, records of labor assignments, and countless other details. Because literacy was rare, scribes enjoyed considerable status and respect. The life of a scribe was far preferable to that of a farmer or laborer, and fathers would often go to great lengths to ensure their sons received scribal training. Priests served the gods through daily rituals performed in temples throughout the land. Each morning, priests would enter the innermost sanctuary of the temple, wake the god's statue with chanting, wash and dress it, and present offerings of food and drink. The god, represented by the statue, would consume the spiritual essence of these offerings, after which the physical food could be distributed among the temple staff. Priests also conducted festivals, interpreted omens, and performed funerary rituals. Some priests were full-time religious professionals, while others served part-time rotations, spending most of their time in secular occupations. Below the priests and scribes came the craftsmen and artisans, carpenters, jewelers, sculptors, painters, metalworkers, potters, and countless other specialists. These workers created the goods that made Egyptian civilization function, from the simple pottery jars used in every household to the elaborate gold jewelry worn by nobles and deposited in royal tombs. Many craftsmen worked in workshops attached to temples or palaces, receiving rations of food and supplies in exchange for their labor. Then came the farmers, who made up the vast majority of the population. Farming in Egypt followed the rhythm of the Nile. During the flood season, when fields were underwater, farmers might work on construction projects, building pyramids, temples, or other royal monuments. Once the waters receded, they would plant their crops, working the soil with wooden plows pulled by oxen. They would tend the growing crops, protecting them from birds and animals, and channeling water from canals when needed. At harvest time, the entire community would work together to gather the grain before the next flood arrived. Life was labor-intensive, but it followed predictable patterns, and in good years, the land provided abundantly. A farmer's family might live in a small house built from mud bricks, with a flat roof where they could sleep during hot nights. The house would have a few rooms, minimal furniture, perhaps some low stools, a bed frame strung with rope or leather, storage jars for grain and water, and simple cooking equipment. The wealthier the family, the larger the house, with courtyards, multiple rooms, and perhaps even a garden with a small pool. Clothing was simple and practical, designed for Egypt's hot climate. Both men and women wore garments made from linen, woven from flax that grew abundantly in the Nile Valley. Men typically wore a simple kilt or loincloth, while women wore long, straight dresses held up by straps. Children often went naked until adolescence. The wealthy could afford finer linen, bleached white and woven more tightly, sometimes even pleated for decoration. Jewelry was popular across all social classes, from simple strings of beads to elaborate collars of gold and precious stones. Food was relatively simple but adequate. Bread and beer were dietary staples, consumed at almost every meal. Egyptian beer was thick and nutritious, more like liquid bread than modern beer, and it provided important calories and nutrients. the wealthy enjoyed meat, beef, pork, goat, and wild game, as well as fish from the Nile, though the poor ate meat only on special occasions. Everyone ate vegetables, onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, cucumbers, and beans. Fruit included dates, figs, and grapes. Honey was used as a sweetener. The Egyptians also enjoyed various bread and cakes, some flavored with honey or dates. Family life was central to Egyptian society. Marriage was generally informal, with couples simply moving in together, though wealthier families might arrange marriages to consolidate property or forge political alliances. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed considerably more rights and autonomy than women in many other ancient civilizations. They could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce, and inherit wealth. Some women even rose to positions of considerable power, serving as priestesses, palace officials, or, in rare cases, as pharaohs. Children were treasured, and high child mortality rates meant that families hoped for many offspring. Children played with the toys, balls, dolls, toy animals, and games. Drawings and artifacts show children playing games that look remarkably familiar. Leapfrog, tug-of-war, juggling, and various ball games. Formal education was limited to the elite, primarily boys who were being trained as scribes, but all children learned the skills they would need as adults through apprenticeship and observation. Entertainment was an important part of Egyptian life. Music was popular, with instruments including harps, lyres, flutes, drums, and rattles. Singers and dancers performed at festivals and private parties. Hunting and fishing were pursued both for food and for sport by those who had leisure time. Board games were extremely popular across all social classes. Senet, perhaps the most famous Egyptian board game, involved moving pieces along a grid according to the throw of dice or sticks, with the game possibly having religious significance related to the journey through the afterlife. Religious festivals punctuated the year, providing breaks from routine labor and opportunities for communities to gather, celebrate, and renew their connection to the gods. These festivals might involve processions where the god's sacred bark, a ceremonial boat containing the deity's statue, would be carried through the streets, allowing ordinary people to petition the god with questions or requests. There would be music, dancing, feasting, and probably considerable consumption of beer. Justice was administered according to the principle of Mayat, the concept of truth, justice, order, and balance that was fundamental to Egyptian thought. Local councils of elders handled the minor disputes, while serious crimes might be adjudicated by appointed officials or even the vizier. Punishment could be severe: beatings, mutilation, forced labor, or execution. But the ideal was always to restore Ma'at, to bring order back into balance, rather than simply to punish. Life expectancy was relatively short by modern standards. Many children died before reaching adulthood. Adults who survived childhood might live into their 40s or 50s, though some, particularly among the upper classes who had better nutrition and access to medical care, lived considerably longer. Death was an ever-present reality, which perhaps explains the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife and with preserving the body and memory of the deceased. Despite the hardships, life in ancient Egypt had its pleasures and satisfactions. The annual flood was predictable, the land was fertile, and in most years there was enough food. The climate was warm and sunny most of the time. Communities were tight-knit, with extended families living in close proximity and supporting one another. Religious festivals provided regular opportunities for celebration and renewal. And everywhere, the works of human hands, temples, statues, monuments, beautifully crafted objects, reminded the people that they were part of something larger than themselves, a civilization that had endured for thousands of years and would, they believed, endure forever. The sacred and the divine. Religion was not something separate from daily life in ancient Egypt. It was woven into every aspect of existence, from the grandest state rituals to the simplest domestic activities. The Egyptians saw the divine everywhere, in the sun's daily journey across the sky, in the Nile's annual flood, in the flight of birds, in the growth of crops, in birth and death and everything between. Their world was populated by gods and goddesses, spirits and demons, and the line between the natural and supernatural was thin and easily crossed. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and complex, with hundreds of deities, each with their own attributes, mythology, and areas of influence. Some gods were worshipped throughout Egypt, while others were primarily local, associated with specific cities or regions. Many gods could take multiple forms, appearing sometimes as animals, sometimes as humans, sometimes as hybrid creatures combining human and animal features. This fluidity reflected a sophisticated theological understanding that the divine could manifest in many ways. At the head of the pantheon, at least during much of Egyptian history, was Ra, the sun god, who sailed across the sky each day in his solar bark, bringing light and warmth to the world. At night, Ra traveled through the underworld, battling the serpent Apophis, who sought to devour the sun and plunge the world into eternal darkness. Ra's daily victory and rebirth each dawn symbolized the triumph of order over chaos, life over death. Osiris was perhaps the most important god for ordinary Egyptians because of his association with the afterlife. Originally an earthly king, Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Set, who dismembered his body and scattered the pieces throughout Egypt. Osiris's wife, Isis, gathered the pieces and, with her powerful magic, reassembled him and brought him back to life long enough to conceive their son, Horus. Afterward, Osiris descended to the underworld, where he became the judge of the dead, determining who was worthy to enter the afterlife and who was not. The myth of Osiris resonated deeply with the Egyptians because it promised that death was not the end. If even a god could be killed and yet continue to exist in the realm of the dead, surely humans could do the same. Osiris showed that resurrection was possible, that the forces of order could triumph over chaos and violence, and that justice would ultimately prevail. Isis was the ideal wife and mother, devoted and resourceful, whose magical power was so great that she tricked Ra himself into revealing his secret name, thereby gaining power over him. She became a protector goddess, particularly associated with women, children, and the dead. Her worship eventually spread far beyond Egypt's borders, reaching throughout the Mediterranean world during the Greco-Roman period. Horus, the son of Osiris and Isis, was represented as a falcon or as a man with a falcon's head. He embodied kingship itself, and every pharaoh was considered to be Horus incarnate, a living god ruling on earth. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris, while his successor took on the role of Horus. This divine cycle of death and rebirth, of father and son, was central to the Egyptian concept of kingship. Other major deities included Amun, originally a local god of Thebes who rose to supreme importance during the New Kingdom, often merging with Ra as Amun-Ra. Ptah was the craftsman god, patron of artisans and builders, worshipped especially in Memphis. Thoth was the god of wisdom, writing, and knowledge, depicted as an ibis or a baboon, and credited with inventing hieroglyphs. Hathor, the cow goddess, embodied love, beauty, music, and motherhood. Sekhmet, the lioness, was a fierce goddess of war and healing, capable of both causing and curing disease. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, oversaw mummification and guided souls to the underworld. The concept of Ma'at was not just a principle but also personified as a goddess, daughter of Ra, depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather in her hair or sometimes just as the feather itself. Ma'at represented truth, justice, harmony, balance, order, and cosmic law. Everything in the universe, from the movements of celestial bodies to the behavior of humans, was supposed to conform to Ma'at. The pharaoh's primary responsibility was to maintain Ma'at throughout the land, ensuring that order prevailed over chaos. Temples were not places where ordinary people gathered for communal worship as in later religious traditions. Instead, they were considered the literal houses of the gods, places where the deities dwelled in the form of statues housed in the innermost sanctuaries. Only priests had access to these sacred spaces, performing the daily rituals necessary to maintain the gods' presence and ensure their continued favor. Egyptian temples were massive stone structures designed to last forever. They were entered through massive gateways called pylons, decorated with colossal statues and relief carvings showing the king smiting enemies or making offerings to the gods. Beyond the pylons lay open courtyards where festival crowds might gather, then columned halls, and finally the dark inner sanctuaries where the gods' statues resided. The temple was designed as a microcosm of the universe at the moment of creation, with the floor representing the earth, the columns like papyrus reeds in the primordial marsh, and the ceiling painted with stars to represent the sky. Temple walls were covered with hieroglyphic texts and relief carvings showing endless processions of the king presenting offerings to the gods. These images were not mere decoration. They were considered magically efficacious, ensuring that the offerings would continue eternally even after the specific king had died. The carved figures of food, drink, and incense would magically sustain the gods forever. Magic was an integral part of Egyptian religion. The Egyptians believed that words and images had power, that the right spells spoken with the right intent could make things happen. Heka, often translated as magic, was considered a fundamental force of the universe, present from the moment of creation. It was not something supernatural, but rather a natural power that could be harnessed through proper knowledge and technique. Priests were experts in Heka, using spells and rituals to heal the sick, protect against evil, divine the future, and assist the dead in their journey to the afterlife. Ordinary people also practiced protective magic, wearing amulets, speaking incantations, and performing small rituals to ward off harm and attract good fortune. The famous Eye of Horus amulet, representing the eye that the god Horus lost in battle with Set and which was magically restored, was worn to promote healing and protection. The Egyptian concept of the soul was complex, involving multiple spiritual components. The Kai was a person's life force, sustained by food and drink offerings. The Bie was closer to what we might call personality or spirit, depicted as a human-headed bird that could fly between the tomb and the world of the living. The Ahech was the transfigured, blessed spirit that had successfully navigated the dangers of the afterlife and now dwelled among the gods. There was also the shadow, the name, and the heart, each representing different aspects of a person's being. Religious festivals were numerous and varied. The Opet festival at Thebes celebrated the renewal of the pharaoh's divine power, with a great procession carrying the sacred barks of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple. The beautiful festival of the valley involved the statue of Amun crossing to the west bank of the Nile to visit the mortuary temples of deceased kings, with families gathering at their ancestors' tombs for feasts and overnight vigils. The festival of drunkenness, associated with the goddess Hathor, involved considerable consumption of beer and wine, commemorating the time when Hathor was appeased from her destructive rage by being given beer dyed red to resemble blood. These festivals served multiple purposes. They reinforced the connection between the gods and the community. They provided structure to the year. They offered relief from the routine of daily labor. And they created a sense of shared identity, reminding everyone that they were part of a civilization blessed by the gods and destined to endure. Yet, despite this public religious life, there was also space for personal piety. Letters to the dead have been found, written on bowls or papyrus and placed in tombs, asking deceased relatives for help with various problems or complaining about wrongs the deceased had committed when alive. Votive offerings at temples and shrines show that ordinary people sought divine help with personal concerns, illness, infertility, legal troubles, protection from enemies. The gods were not distant abstractions but active presences who could and would intervene in human affairs. The Egyptian religious worldview was fundamentally optimistic. Yes, there were dangers, demons, disease, death, chaos, but the forces of order were stronger. The sun rose each day. The Nile flooded each year. Ma'at prevailed. The righteous dead would be judged favorably by Osiris and granted eternal life. This confidence in cosmic order, this belief that the universe was fundamentally benevolent and that right would ultimately triumph, permeated Egyptian culture and gave the civilization its remarkable stability and longevity. Masters of medicine. The ancient Egyptians practiced medicine with a sophistication that would not be surpassed in the Western world for thousands of years. They understood that while the gods and demons might cause disease, practical treatments could often cure it. They developed a system of medicine that blended empirical observation, rational diagnosis, effective treatments, and magical ritual into a comprehensive healing art that served their civilization remarkably well. Egyptian medical knowledge has been preserved in several papyrus documents that have survived from antiquity. The most famous is the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, but probably copied from earlier texts. This scroll is over 60 feet long and contains more than 700 medical formulas and remedies for ailments ranging from skin problems to digestive complaints, from eye diseases to psychological conditions. The treatments described show a detailed understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and clinical practice. Another important text is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which focuses on surgery and traumatic injuries. This remarkable document describes 48 cases, organized systematically from head to toe with each case following a consistent format: title, examination, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. The clinical descriptions are precise and practical, noting symptoms, describing surgical procedures, and even discussing prognosis realistically, distinguishing between ailments that could be cured, those that might be treated but not cured, and those beyond the physician's ability to treat. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains the first known descriptions of the brain, though the Egyptians did not fully understand its function. It describes skull fractures, spinal injuries, and techniques for setting broken bones and treating dislocations. Some of the surgical techniques it describes, such as using sutures to close wounds and applying honey as an antiseptic, are sound practices that would be recognized by modern surgeons. Egyptian physicians understood that the body contained a system of vessels that carried blood, air, and other fluids throughout the body. They described this system in terms remarkably similar to our understanding of the circulatory system, though they believed all vessels originated from the heart, which they correctly identified as the center of circulation. They could feel the pulse and knew that it was connected to the heart's beating. The Egyptians recognized many specific diseases and conditions. They could diagnose diabetes, noting that patients produced excessive amounts of sweet-smelling urine. They knew about cancer, describing tumors in various parts of the body. They understood that some ailments were infectious and could spread from person to person. They recognized the symptoms of malaria, tuberculosis, and various parasitic infections that were common in the Nile Valley. Mummy studies have confirmed that many of the diseases described in the papyri were indeed present in ancient Egypt. Surgical tools excavated from tombs show that Egyptian surgeons had access to effective instruments. Bronze or copper scalpels, forceps, scissors, saws, and probes have all been found. The oldest known metal surgical instruments in the world come from Egypt. These tools were well designed and capable of performing a range of procedures, from simple wound treatment to complex operations. Dental problems were common in ancient Egypt, partly because the bread that was a dietary staple was made from stone-ground flour that contained grit from the grinding stones. This grit wore down teeth and led to abscesses and infections. Egyptian physicians treated dental problems with medicinal preparations, and could perform tooth extractions. Evidence from mummies shows that some had dental work, including holes drilled to drain abscesses, and at least one mummy has been found with two teeth joined together by gold wire, suggesting an early form of bridge work or prosthetic. Pharmacology was sophisticated. The Ebers Papyrus lists hundreds of substances used in medicines. Plant materials like castor oil, aloe, garlic, onion, saffron, and poppy. Animal products like honey, milk, and various fats, and minerals like copper salts and natron. Many of these substances have genuine therapeutic value. Honey, for example, is an effective antiseptic. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Castor oil is a powerful laxative. The Egyptians had discovered through trial and error which substances helped which conditions. Medical training likely took place in institutions called Per Ankh, or houses of life, which were associated with temples and served as libraries, schools, and centers of learning. Students would copy medical texts, learning the traditional formulas and procedures. They would observe experienced physicians treating patients, gradually gaining practical experience. The profession was respected, and successful physicians could enjoy considerable wealth and status. There were medical specialists in ancient Egypt, perhaps the first such specialization in history. There were eye doctors, dentists, doctors who specialized in the stomach, even one whose title translates as guardian of the anus, essentially a proctologist. Royal physicians served the pharaoh and his family, while other doctors might work in temples, in the army, or as private practitioners. Women could practice medicine in ancient Egypt. The earliest known female physician, Meret Ptah, lived during the Second Dynasty around 2700 BCE and was described as a chief physician. Later, female physicians included Pesachet, who lived during the Old Kingdom and held the title Lady Overseer of Female Physicians, suggesting she supervised other women doctors. Yet Egyptian medicine was not purely rational. It coexisted with a strong belief in the supernatural causes of disease. Many ailments were attributed to angry gods, demons, or the malevolent dead. Even the medical papyri, which contain many practical treatments, also include magical spells to be recited during treatment. Amulets were worn to prevent illness. Incantations were spoken to drive out demons. The goddess Sekhmet was both the sender of plagues and the mistress of physicians. The god Thoth was credited with inventing medicine. Imhotep, the architect of the Step Pyramid, was deified as a god of healing. This blend of rational and magical approaches might seem contradictory from a modern perspective, but for the ancient Egyptians, it made perfect sense. The world was filled with both natural and supernatural forces, and both needed to be addressed. A broken bone could be set and splinted, but one might also invoke the god Horus, who had his own injuries magically healed by his mother Isis. An herbal remedy might treat the physical symptoms, while a spell addressed the spiritual causes of the illness. The Egyptian understanding of the body was grounded in their experience with mummification, which required removing internal organs and thus provided direct observation of human anatomy. However, They did not practice dissection for medical study, and their understanding of physiology was limited by their cultural and religious beliefs. They knew that death occurred when the heart stopped, but they did not understand the brain's role in consciousness and thought, believing instead that the heart was the organ of thought and emotion. Egyptian physicians were renowned throughout the ancient world. Foreign kings requested Egyptian doctors to come treat them and their families. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, who is often called the father of medicine, acknowledged their debt to Egyptian medical knowledge. Greek and Roman medical texts show clear influence from Egyptian practices and remedies. The Egyptians' approach to public health was also advanced for its time. They understood the importance of cleanliness. Priests bathed multiple times per day and shaved their bodies to avoid lice. The Egyptians practiced circumcision, possibly for hygienic reasons. They were careful about food preparation and storage. They developed latrines and drainage systems in their cities. These practices, combined with the dry climate, helped keep disease at manageable levels. The medical system was not perfect, of course. Child mortality was high. Many diseases that are easily treatable today were fatal then. Pain management was limited, though they did have access to opium and other natural analgesics. Surgery without anesthesia would have been agonizing. But within the constraints of their knowledge and technology, Egyptian physicians achieved remarkable results, allowing their civilization to thrive for millennia. Death and the afterlife. No aspect of ancient Egyptian civilization fascinates us more than their elaborate treatment of death. The massive tombs, the preserved mummies, the treasures buried with the dead, the detailed texts describing the journey through the underworld. All of these speak to a culture that believed death was not an ending, but a transformation, a doorway into another form of existence that could last forever. The Egyptians believed that human beings possessed multiple spiritual components, each of which needed to be preserved and provided for after death. The physical body, the Khat, needed to be preserved because the other spiritual elements required it as an anchor in the physical world. This belief led to the development of mummification, one of ancient Egypt's most distinctive practices. The earliest mummies were probably accidental, created when bodies buried in the hot, dry desert sand were naturally desiccated before they could decay. Over time, the Egyptians realized that this preservation was desirable and began to develop artificial methods to achieve the same result. By the time of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE, mummification had become an elaborate process that could take up to 70 days. The process began soon after death. The body was taken to a special tent or building called the Pernifer, the House of Beauty, or House of Mummification. There, specialized priests known as embalmers would perform the transformation. First, the brain was removed, usually by inserting a long hook through the nostril, breaking through the thin bone at the base of the skull, and extracting the brain matter in pieces. The Egyptians did not consider the brain important, so it was simply discarded. Next, an incision was made in the left side of the abdomen, and the internal organs were removed. The liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines were each mummified separately and placed in special jars called canopic jars. each protected by one of the four sons of Horus. The heart, considered the seat of intelligence and emotion, was left in place because it would be needed in the afterlife for the judgment of the dead. The body cavity was washed and filled with temporary stuffing. Then the entire body was covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt that absorbed moisture. The body would lie in natron for about 40 days, slowly drying out. Once fully desiccated, the temporary stuffing was removed and replaced with linen, sawdust, and aromatic substances like myrrh and cassia. The body cavity was sealed, and the external incision was closed. The embalmers would then begin the wrapping. The body was coated with resin and carefully wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. Between the layers, amulets were placed to magically protect different parts of the body. The wrapping followed specific patterns, with fingers and toes wrapped individually before the limbs were wrapped, then the trunk, and finally the head. A mask might be placed over the face, and for royalty, this could be made of gold, like the famous mask of Tutankhamun. While the body was being mummified, craftsmen would be preparing the tomb and the equipment needed for the afterlife. For royalty and the wealthy, this meant a tomb cut into rock, with walls decorated with scenes from the person's life and texts from the Book of the Dead. It meant furniture, clothing, jewelry, weapons, tools, games, cosmetics, everything the deceased might need or want. It meant provisions, jars of food and drink, sides of beef, bread, beer, wine, honey. The funeral itself was an elaborate ceremony. The mummy, in its decorated coffin, would be transported in a procession to the tomb, accompanied by professional mourners who wailed and tore their hair, priests who chanted spells and burned incense, and family members who carried offerings. At the tomb entrance, priests would perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual that magically restored the deceased's ability to eat, drink, breathe, speak, and see in the afterlife. Once the mummy was placed in the tomb, the entrance would be sealed, sometimes with the seal of the necropolis, a jackal over 9 captives, symbolizing Anubis's power over death and enemies. The family would maintain the tomb, bringing regular offerings of food and drink to sustain the chaos. If the family died out or could no longer afford to maintain the tomb, priests might be hired to continue the offerings, or magical substitutes. Images of food carved and painted on the walls, or small models of servants performing tasks, would serve the same purpose. But what happened to the deceased's spirit after death? The Egyptians developed elaborate mythologies describing this journey. After the funeral, the deceased would have to navigate the Duat, the underworld, a dangerous realm filled with demons, lakes of fire, and hostile gods. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions, was often buried with the deceased to serve as a guide through these perils. It contained spells to transform into various creatures, to repel attackers, to open doors, and to navigate the complex geography of the underworld. The ultimate goal was to reach the Hall of Two Truths, where Osiris sat in judgment, attended by 42 divine judges and watched over by Ammit, the Devourer, a hybrid creature with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. There, the deceased's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, symbolizing truth and justice. If the person had lived a good life according to Ma'at, speaking truth, acting justly, not committing murder or theft, not causing suffering, showing respect to the gods and to parents, the heart would balance with the feather. Thoth would record the result, and Osiris would declare the person justified. The deceased could then enter the field of reeds, a paradise that looked like Egypt itself, but where the crops grew taller, the water was always cool and clean, and life was eternally pleasant. But if the heart was heavy with sin, outweighing the feather, Ammit would devour it, and the person would experience the second death, permanent annihilation. This was the true death that the Egyptians feared, not the physical death that everyone experienced, but the complete obliteration of the soul, the end of existence. To avoid this fate, the deceased would recite the negative confession, a long list of sins they claimed not to have committed. I have not killed. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. I have not caused tears. This confession was both a statement and a magical spell, words that would make the heart light regardless of the person's actual deeds. Egyptian ethics and magic were intertwined. Proper words spoken properly had power. Not everyone could afford elaborate mummification and a well-stocked tomb. The poor might be wrapped in a simple reed mat and buried in the sand with a few pottery vessels. But even the poorest families tried to preserve the body if possible and provide at least minimal grave goods. The afterlife was not reserved for the elite. Every Egyptian, rich or poor, hoped to be justified before Osiris and enter eternal life. The tombs of the wealthy have provided archaeologists with an incredible wealth of information about ancient Egyptian life. Because the Egyptians believed the dead would need everything they had in life, they buried actual objects or models of objects, creating a complete snapshot of their material culture. We have furniture, clothing, tools, weapons, jewelry, games, cosmetics, musical instruments, writing equipment, the entire range of objects used in daily life. We have models showing workshops, boats, armies, and farms. We have paintings showing hunting, farming, fishing, feasting, dancing, and music making. We have texts describing beliefs, spells, literature, and history. The tombs were meant to preserve these things forever, and to a remarkable degree, they succeeded. The dry desert climate, the stone construction, and the intentional sealing of tombs created conditions where organic materials could survive for thousands of years. When archaeologists opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, they found bread, wine, meat, oils, and even flowers that were still recognizable after more than 3,000 years. Yet, the Egyptians' obsession with preserving the dead also attracted thieves. From ancient times to the present, tomb robbing has been a constant threat. Robbers sought the gold, jewelry, and valuable objects buried with the dead. They smashed mummies searching for amulets hidden in the wrappings. They destroyed priceless artifacts to get at precious materials. Most royal tombs were robbed in antiquity, sometimes within years or even months of the burial. The tomb of Tutankhamun survived largely intact only because it was relatively modest, and its entrance was covered by debris from the construction of a later tomb. Despite the losses to robbery and time, enough has survived to give us an extraordinarily detailed picture of ancient Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife. And what emerges is a culture that faced mortality with neither denial nor despair, but with an elaborate, carefully constructed hope. Death was transformation, not ending. The dead lived on if properly prepared and remembered. The universe was ordered in such a way that those who had lived rightly would continue to exist in paradise. Life might be temporary, but existence could be eternal. Innovation and discovery. The ancient Egyptians were more than builders of monuments and masters of mummification. They were innovators who made fundamental contributions to mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and technology. Many of their inventions and discoveries remained in use for thousands of years, and some are still with us today. One of Egypt's most important inventions was papyrus paper. Made from the papyrus plant that grew abundantly in the Nile marshes, this writing material was lighter, more portable, and easier to use than the stone tablets or clay tablets used by other ancient civilizations. To make papyrus, the pithy interior of the papyrus stem was cut into thin strips which were laid side by side. Another layer of strips was laid crosswise on top. The two layers were pressed together, and the plant's natural juices acted as an adhesive, bonding them into a single sheet. When dried and polished, the result was a smooth writing surface that could be rolled into scrolls. Papyrus was Egypt's most important export for thousands of years. It was used throughout the Mediterranean world and remained the primary writing material in Europe until the medieval period. The word paper itself comes from papyrus, though modern paper is made from entirely different materials. Writing ink was another Egyptian innovation. They developed black ink from soot or charcoal mixed with gum and water, and red ink from red ochre mixed with the same binders. These inks remained remarkably stable, which is why hieroglyphic texts and papyrus documents written thousands of years ago can still be read today. Scribes wrote with brushes made from reeds, with one end chewed to separate the fibers into a brush-like tip. Egyptian mathematics was sophisticated and practical. They used a decimal system based on powers of 10, with specific hieroglyphs for 1, 10, 100, 1,000, and so on. They could add, subtract, multiply, and divide. They understood fractions, though they preferred unit fractions where the numerator is always 1. They could calculate areas, volumes, and the slopes of pyramids. The Moscow mathematical papyrus and the Rhind mathematical papyrus show that they could solve complex problems involving arithmetic and geometric progressions. Their understanding of geometry was especially advanced. Building projects like the pyramids required precise measurements and calculations. The Egyptians could calculate the area of triangles, rectangles, and circles with reasonable accuracy. They knew the formula for the volume of a cylinder and a truncated pyramid. They could determine right angles using a tool called a merket, which worked like a plumb line. For surveying large areas, they used ropes with knots at regular intervals to measure distances accurately. The Egyptian calendar was another significant achievement. They divided the years into 365 days, organized into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days at the end of the year. This was remarkably close to the actual solar year of 365 and 1/4 days, and it's the basic structure still used in calendars today. The slight discrepancy meant that the calendar gradually drifted out of sync with the seasons, but it was still the most practical calendar system of the ancient world. The calendar was based on careful astronomical observations. The Egyptians tracked the movements of stars and planets, noting that Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, rose just before sunrise at roughly the same time as the Nile's annual flood. This helaico rising of Sirius marked the beginning of their new year. They divided the night sky into 36 regions, each marked by a specific constellation. They recognized the planets, which they called the stars that know no rest, because they moved against the fixed background of other stars. Egyptian astronomy was primarily practical rather than theoretical. They used celestial observations for timekeeping, for determining the optimal times for religious festivals, and for orienting their temples and monuments. Many temples were aligned to specific astronomical events: the sun rising on the winter solstice, the helaico rising of a particular star, or the position of the sun at the time of the pharaoh's birth. Timekeeping devices included sundials and water clocks. The Egyptians divided both day and night into 12 hours each, though because the length of daylight varies with the seasons, their hours were not of constant length. Sundials showed the time during daylight by the shadow cast by a vertical gnomon. Water clocks, called clepsydrai, measured time by the steady drip of water from one vessel to another, allowing for time measurement at night and indoors. Medicine, as we've discussed, was another field where Egyptian innovation was remarkable. They developed surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic methods that influenced later civilizations. Egyptian medical texts were translated into other languages and studied by physicians for centuries after Egypt itself had fallen. The Egyptians also pioneered various craft technologies. They were among the first to work copper on a large scale, and they developed bronze by mixing copper and tin. They made glass, creating beautiful beads and small vessels by core-forming methods. They developed faience, a glazed ceramic material used for beads, amulets, and decorative objects. They created durable dyes and developed complex weaving techniques for linen cloth. In agriculture, the Egyptians developed sophisticated irrigation systems that allowed them to control water distribution and expand the amount of cultivable land. They invented or improved various farming tools, including the ox-drawn plow, the sickle, and the shaduf, a counterweighted pole for lifting water from the Nile to higher fields. They practiced crop rotation and used animal manure as fertilizer. Shipbuilding was another area of Egyptian expertise. They developed some of the earliest large wooden ships, using techniques like edge-joining planks and lashing them together with rope. Egyptian ships could sail both on the Nile and in the open Mediterranean and Red Seas, allowing them to trade with distant lands. The Egyptians may have been among the first to use sails systematically, harnessing wind power for transportation. They developed standardized units of measure for length, area, volume, and weight, essential for large-scale construction projects and trade. The royal cubit, divided into 7 palms of 4 digits each, was standardized to ensure consistency. They developed surveying techniques that allowed them to reestablish property boundaries after the annual flood had erased all markers. Egyptian innovations in art and architecture influenced countless later civilizations. They developed the technique of relief carving, where figures are carved slightly raised or sunken from the background. They established principles of proportion and composition that defined artistic conventions for 3,000 years. Their architectural achievements, the pyramids, the temples, the obelisks, pushed the boundaries of what was possible with stone construction. In chemistry, although they did not understand it in modern terms, the Egyptians were skilled practical chemists. Mummification required knowledge of how different substances affected organic tissue. Making glass and faience required understanding how heat transformed raw materials. Creating pigments and dyes involved combining minerals and plants to produce specific colors. Metallurgy required controlling fire temperatures and understanding how different materials could be combined. The Egyptians did not develop these technologies and discoveries in isolation. They traded with other civilizations, exchanging goods and ideas. They learned from others and taught others. But they synthesized what they learned into a distinctive Egyptian approach that reflected their values, their beliefs, and their environmental circumstances. What's remarkable is not just the individual innovations, but their longevity. Egyptian technology and knowledge remained relevant for thousands of years. The Romans, who conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, continued to use Egyptian techniques in many fields. The Greek scholars who studied in Alexandria built on foundations laid by Egyptian thinkers centuries earlier. Arab scholars in the medieval period translated Egyptian medical texts and astronomical observations, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The practical, empirical approach that characterized Egyptian innovation, observing natural phenomena, experimenting with materials, refining techniques through trial and error, recording successful methods for future use, established patterns of scientific thinking that we still follow today. Power and glory. After the political fragmentation of the First Intermediate Period, Egypt was reunified around 2055 BCE by Mentuhotep II, a Theban prince who restored central authority and ushered in the Middle Kingdom. This was a period of renewed prosperity and cultural achievement that lasted until about 1650 BCE. But the most spectacular era of Egyptian power came later, during the New Kingdom, from approximately 1550 to 1077 BCE, when Egypt built an empire and reached the peak of its wealth and influence. The New Kingdom began with a war of liberation. Egypt had been conquered by foreign rulers called the Hyksos, who controlled much of Lower Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. Around 1550 BCE, the Theban rulers finally drove the Hyksos out, pursuing them into Palestine and establishing Egypt as a major military power. This experience of foreign domination had changed Egyptian attitudes. No longer would they be content to remain isolated in their Nile Valley. They would project power abroad, conquering neighboring territories and establishing an empire. The pharaohs of the New Kingdom were warriors who led their armies personally into battle. They conquered Nubia to the south, controlling the gold mines and trade routes that brought wealth from the African interior. They campaigned in Syria and Palestine, extending Egyptian influence into the Near East and coming into conflict with the Hittite Empire, the other great power of the age. At its height, the Egyptian Empire stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile in Nubia to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Hatshepsut, who ruled from about 1478 to 1458 BCE, was one of the most successful pharaohs of this era, and one of the few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh rather than as queen. She came to power as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, but eventually took the title of pharaoh herself, even being depicted in official art wearing the false beard and other regalia of kingship. Her reign was marked more by trade expeditions and building projects than by military conquest. She sent a famous expedition to the mysterious land of Punt, probably located along the Red Sea coast of modern Somalia or Eritrea, bringing back myrrh trees, ivory, exotic animals, and other luxury goods. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of the most beautiful structures in Egypt, a series of colonnaded terraces built into the cliffs of the Theban Mountains. After her death, Thutmose III, who had finally gained power in his own right, ordered her monuments defaced and her name chiseled from inscriptions, perhaps trying to erase her unconventional reign from history. But enough survived for us to recognize her as one of ancient Egypt's most capable rulers. Thutmose III himself became Egypt's greatest military pharaoh, leading 17 campaigns into Syria and Palestine, earning the nickname the Napoleon of Ancient Egypt. He won a crucial victory at Megiddo, where he defeated a coalition of Syrian princes and extended Egyptian control to its greatest extent. The wealth that flowed into Egypt from conquered territories and tributary states funded massive building projects and made Egypt the richest state in the ancient world. Later in the New Kingdom came one of Egypt's most controversial figures, Akhenaten, who ruled from 1353 to 1336 BCE. Akhenaten attempted a religious revolution, abandoning the traditional polytheistic religion and instead promoting the exclusive worship of the Aten, the sun disk. He closed the temples of the other gods, moved the capital from Thebes to a new city called Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and had himself depicted in a startlingly naturalistic style that broke with thousands of years of artistic convention. Akhenaten's religious reforms did not survive him. His successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, restored the traditional gods and moved the capital back to Thebes. Tutankhamun himself is famous today not for his achievements as a ruler. He died young, probably around age 18, and accomplished little. But because his tomb, discovered nearly intact by Howard Carter in 1902, revealed the incredible treasures buried with New Kingdom royalty. The solid gold coffins, the famous gold mask, the thrones and chariots and jewelry, the shrines and statues that filled the tomb gave the world its most complete picture of Egyptian royal burial customs. After a brief period of decline, Egypt's power was restored by the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, particularly Seti I and his son Ramesses II. Ramesses II, known as Rameses the Great, ruled for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, one of the longest reigns in history. He was a prolific builder, erecting monuments throughout Egypt and Nubia. His greatest achievement was the temple at Abu Simbel, carved into a cliff face in Nubia, with 4 colossal statues of the seated pharaoh, each over 60 feet tall, guarding the entrance. Ramesses fought a famous battle against the Hittites at Kadesh in Syria around 1274 BCE. Egyptian texts portray this as a great victory, with Ramesses personally rallying his troops and routing the enemy. Hittite texts tell a different story. The truth seems to be that the battle was indecisive, and both sides claimed victory. But the conflict eventually led to one of the ancient world's most important diplomatic achievements, the first recorded peace treaty, signed between Egypt and the Hittites around 1259 BCE. Copies of this treaty, inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, have survived, showing that the two great powers agreed to mutual peace, defense, and the extradition of refugees. Ramesses left monuments everywhere, and many later pharaohs carved their names on his statues and buildings, borrowing his prestige. He sired more than 100 children, ensuring the succession of his dynasty. When he died, probably in his early 90s, he was buried in the Valley of the Kings, though his mummy was later moved to protect it from tomb robbers. His mummy, now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, shows an elderly man with arthritis, dental problems, and a hooked nose, allowing us to see the actual face of one of history's great rulers. The New Kingdom also saw the development of the Valley of the Kings as the royal necropolis. Instead of building pyramids, which advertised the location of the royal tomb and thus attracted robbers, New Kingdom pharaohs cut their tombs into the rock of a desert valley near Thebes. The tombs were hidden with their entrances sealed and concealed after burial. Despite these precautions, almost all were robbed in antiquity. Only Tutankhamun's modest tomb survived substantially intact. The wealth of the New Kingdom supported a flowering of art and literature. Temple walls and tomb paintings reached extraordinary levels of sophistication and beauty. Poetry, wisdom literature, love songs, and stories were written on papyrus and passed down through generations. The tale of Sinuhe, the story of the shipwrecked sailor, and the instructions of Amenemope are just a few examples of Egyptian literature that has survived. But no empire lasts forever. The late New Kingdom saw Egypt's power gradually decline. The wealth that conquest had brought attracted envy and ambition. Egypt faced invasions from Libyans, attacks by the mysterious Sea Peoples, and internal strife. The priesthood, particularly the priests of Amun at Thebes, accumulated so much wealth and power that they rivaled the pharaohs themselves. Eventually, Egypt split once again, with the priests ruling Upper Egypt while a new dynasty ruled from the Delta. Foreign powers that had once feared Egypt now saw it as a prize to be won. The Libyans established their own dynasties. The Nubians conquered Egypt and ruled as the 25th dynasty. The Assyrians invaded, sacked Thebes, and briefly controlled Egypt. The Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, ruling it as a province of their empire. Brief periods of Egyptian independence followed, but the age of Egyptian greatness was over. Then, in 332 BCE, Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt, ending Persian rule but establishing Macedonian control. After Alexander's death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, established a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were Greeks who adopted Egyptian customs and presented themselves as pharaohs, but they spoke Greek, promoted Greek culture, and made Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded, into the greatest cultural center of the Hellenistic world. The last of the Ptolemies was Cleopatra VII, perhaps Egypt's most famous ruler. Intelligent, educated, politically astute, she tried to maintain Egypt's independence by allying first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony. But after Antony's defeat by Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and his subsequent suicide, Cleopatra too killed herself, ending both the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egyptian independence. Egypt became a province of Rome, its wealth now feeding the Roman Empire. Yet even under foreign rule, Egyptian culture proved remarkably resilient. Temples continued to be built and maintained. The traditional religion survived for centuries more. Hieroglyphs continued to be carved until the 4th century CE. But gradually, as Egypt became Christian and then Muslim, knowledge of the ancient language and religion faded. By the medieval period, Egypt's ancient past had become mysterious, its writing unreadable, its monuments silent witnesses to a lost civilization. Legacy and rediscovery. For over 1,000 years, ancient Egypt was lost. The hieroglyphs carved on temple walls and tomb chambers could not be read. The religion that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years was forgotten, its gods reduced to peculiar figures in Greek and Roman writings. The monuments still stood, the pyramids, the temples, the Sphinx, but they had become mysteries, their purpose and meaning obscured by time. Europeans who visited Egypt brought back tales of wonders but little understanding. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 included not just soldiers but scholars, who systematically documented Egyptian monuments, creating detailed descriptions and drawings. But they could not read the inscriptions. The hieroglyphs remained an impenetrable code, preserving secrets that no living person could access. Then came one of archaeology's greatest breakthroughs. In 1799, French soldiers rebuilding a fort near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta discovered a large black stone covered with inscriptions. The Rosetta Stone, as it came to be known, contained the same text written in 3 scripts: Greek, which scholars could read; Demotic, the everyday script of later Egypt; and hieroglyphs, the sacred script. When the British defeated the French in Egypt, they acquired the Rosetta Stone and brought it to the British Museum. Scholars immediately recognized its importance. If they could match the Greek text to the hieroglyphs, they might finally crack the code that had frustrated investigators for centuries. The breakthrough came from Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar who had devoted his life to understanding Egyptian writing. Working with the Rosetta Stone and other bilingual texts, Champollion made the crucial realization. Hieroglyphs were not just symbolic pictures. They also represented sounds, functioning as a phonetic alphabet. The oval rings, called cartouches, contained royal names. By matching those names to the Greek text, Champollion could assign sound values to hieroglyphic signs. In 1822, he announced his discovery, and for the first time in more than 1,000 years, the words of the ancient Egyptians could be read. The decipherment of hieroglyphs opened a flood of understanding. Suddenly, the inscriptions on temple walls, the texts in tombs, the writing on papyri could be translated. Ancient Egyptian history, literature, religion, science, and daily life could be studied from their own records rather than through the often distorted lens of Greek and Roman accounts. Egyptology was born as a scholarly discipline. Archaeologists began systematic excavation of Egyptian sites. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, major discoveries followed one after another. The tomb of Seti Wurst with its beautiful paintings, the intact tomb of Yuya and Thuyu, parents of Queen Tiye, the cache of royal mummies at Deir el-Bahari, where priests had hidden the bodies of some of Egypt's greatest pharaohs to protect them from tomb robbers, the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, which provided unprecedented information about daily life, the Amarna tablets, diplomatic correspondence that revealed international relations in the Late Bronze Age. But nothing could match the sensation caused by the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Howard Carter, an English archaeologist, had searched the Valley of the Kings for years, funded by Lord Carnarvon. Carter was about to give up when his workers uncovered steps leading down into the rock. Carter excavated the stairway, finding a sealed doorway bearing the seal of the royal necropolis. When he opened it, he found a passage filled with rubble. At the end of the passage was another sealed doorway. On November 26, 1922, Carter made a small hole in the second doorway and held up a candle. The light revealed a room packed with golden objects, furniture, statues, chests, and chariots. When Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied with perhaps the most famous words in archaeology, "Yes, wonderful things." It took Carter nearly 10 years to fully excavate and document the tomb. There were over 5,000 objects, many of exquisite craftsmanship. 3 coffins nested inside each other, the innermost made of solid gold, weighing over 200 pounds. A gold mask covered the king's mummy, showing the young pharaoh's face in idealized form. Shrines of gilded wood, one inside the other, protected the coffins. Furniture, including beautifully carved beds and chairs. Chests containing clothing. Weapons inlaid with gold and precious stones. Games, writing equipment, musical instruments. Food, wine, and oils. Everything a king might need for eternity. The discovery captured the world's imagination. Newspapers devoted front-page coverage to each new find. When several people associated with the excavation died in the following years, the press invented the curse of the mummy, despite there being no actual curse and the deaths having perfectly natural explanations. The story of Tutankhamun became part of popular culture, ensuring that even people with no interest in archaeology knew his name. modern archaeology has become increasingly sophisticated. Instead of treasure hunting, archaeologists now use scientific methods to understand ancient Egyptian society in all its complexity. They study not just royal tombs, but also workers' villages, agricultural settlements, and industrial sites. They analyze ancient DNA to understand population genetics and family relationships. They use radiocarbon dating to establish precise chronologies. They employ satellite imagery to locate buried structures. They reconstruct ancient environments and climate patterns. Recent discoveries continue to add to our understanding. In 2015, archaeologists announced possible evidence of hidden chambers in Tutankhamun's tomb, perhaps containing the burial of Queen Nefertiti, though this remains controversial. In 2019, archaeologists discovered a Ptolemaic temple in Alexandria. In 2020, they found a huge cache of sealed coffins at Saqqara, undisturbed for over 2,000 years. In 2021, they discovered the Lost Golden City near Luxor, a settlement from Amenhotep III's reign, preserved in remarkable condition. Each discovery adds pieces to the vast puzzle of understanding ancient Egyptian civilization. But beyond academic interest, Egypt's legacy continues to influence our world in profound ways. The pyramids remain among humanity's most recognizable monuments, symbols of human ambition and capability. Egyptian art, with its distinctive style and symbolism, continues to influence artists and designers. Egyptian motifs appear in architecture, jewelry, fashion, and popular culture. More fundamentally, many aspects of Western civilization trace back, at least in part, to Egyptian origins. Our calendar derives from the Egyptian solar calendar. Many medical practices and treatments have roots in Egyptian medicine. Geometric principles first articulated by Egyptian engineers inform modern mathematics. The Greek alphabet, ancestor of our own, was influenced by Egyptian hieratic script. The Egyptian emphasis on life after death, on moral behavior being judged by divine powers, and on resurrection influenced later religious traditions. The Hebrew Bible shows Egyptian influence in its narratives and concepts. Early Christianity developed in Egypt, and Egyptian monks pioneered the monastic tradition. Islamic scholarship preserved and transmitted Egyptian knowledge. Egypt thus contributed to the three great Abrahamic religions. Perhaps most importantly, ancient Egypt stands as a testament to human potential. For 3,000 years, a civilization endured, adapted, created, and dreamed. They built monuments that were meant to last forever, and many have. They developed technologies and systems of thought that remained useful for millennia after their civilization ended. They created art of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. They asked fundamental questions about life, death, justice, and the nature of existence, and they tried to answer them. When we look at the pyramids, when we see a mummy in a museum, when we read the words of an ancient Egyptian poet or physician, we are connecting across an enormous gulf of time with people who lived and died thousands of years ago. Yet we can understand them. Their hopes and fears, their loves and losses, their desire to create something lasting and meaningful. These are fundamentally human concerns that transcend time and culture. Ancient Egypt reminds us that civilizations can rise and endure for thousands of years, but they can also fall and be forgotten. It reminds us that the works of our hands and minds may outlast us, speaking to people who will live long after we are gone. It reminds us that we are part of a long human story, inheritors of the achievements and wisdom of countless generations, and that we too will leave a legacy for those who come after us. As we close this journey through ancient Egypt, let the images we've explored settle into memory like sand blown across the desert, covering the traces of those who walked before us while also, somehow, preserving them. If you found peace in this exploration, I invite you again to like this video and subscribe to the Sleepy Science Society. Your support helps these stories reach others who seek knowledge wrapped in quietness, learning embraced by rest. For now, let yourself drift. The pyramids stand silently under starlight. The Nile flows as it always has, carrying life through the desert. The ancient words carved in stone wait patiently to be read. And you can rest knowing that somewhere in the great expanse of human history, there were people who looked up at the same stars, wondered at the same mysteries, and left behind evidence that we are all connected across time. Good night.